Good morning. I'm Hussain Haqqani from the Hudson Institute. Welcome to this morning's session on our conference on markets, civil society, and democratic change in the Middle East. There's a joke in Washington, D.C. that morning panel at think tanks comprise three distinct segments of audience. First, there are the scholars who come actually to learn and talk about the subject. Then there are the students who come in the hope of a free meal. And the third component comprises of federal government employees who'd rather be anywhere than at their desks. Because of the government shutdown, I have a feeling that the third segment is the one that we are missing today. The purpose of this conference is to actually touch upon a subject that has not received as much attention as it ought to. And we are delighted to be able to host this conference, this one-day conference. We have seen change in the Middle East, change primarily inspired by people in the streets, the Arab Spring. Then we have seen attempts to reverse that change, especially in Egypt. The real issue remains: what would ensure lasting change in that region that is democratic in nature? And what we hope to talk about today, especially in the morning session with two wonderful panelists, is to what extent can free markets and the encouragement of a market economy help change society. Now, there are societies in transition, and one of our speakers actually just presented me with a copy of a book called Pathways to Freedom, in which there is a study of many countries, whether it's Brazil or Mexico, whether it's South Korea or Thailand, of how these countries, after long periods of authoritarian rule or intermittent authoritarian rule, have found relative stability in their democratic transitions, primarily because of their adherence to free market principles. And how would that change come to the Middle East? Now, there has always been a view that change in the Middle East will come primarily based on interstate relations. If we solve the Israeli-Palestinian question, somehow the region would become stable. There has been a view that authoritarian regimes are the only means of providing stability. Those views have now been proved, at least over the last 6 decades, as not necessarily true. So let us look at the question of, can free markets be the means of promoting democratic change in the Middle East? And our panel today has two great speakers who are very knowledgeable on the subject. Abdul Wahab Al-Kebsi to the far left, as if I had to tell the distinction between who is Isabel Coleman and Abdul Wahab Kebsi, but sometimes habits die hard.
The hair will give us away.
Yeah. Abdul Wahab Al-Kebsi is the Regional Director for Africa and MENA at the Center for International Private Enterprise. And he oversees a program of democracy and market-oriented reform in over 30 countries. Prior to joining CIPE, he was at the National Endowment for Democracy and was also involved with the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, which is a non-profit think tank based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to studying Islamic and democratic political thought and of finding ways of merging it into contemporary democratic discourse. He has written extensively. He is a regular presence on American and Middle Eastern media. And I will invite Abdul Wahab Al-Kebsi to be our first speaker today, partly because he has a PowerPoint and that may set the pace for the discussion. So Abdul Wahab, you go first.
Hussain, thank you very, very much. There's a fourth group that comes to these interesting events, which is groups that promise each other they will meet and have lunch and never get to see each other until they're invited to a conference. So I apologize. Thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure. I thank you, Hussain. I thank Hudson for this opportunity. And it's just such an, just working just like this. It is on. Try. We have the laptop somewhere, somebody just move it, I can just point to you and you can move it. That's it. That's the third page already. We're on the third page already. All right, so does it work from there? Just point to you. Okay. Thank you. So the subject is really intense and could take a whole course to discuss, a whole college course, but I'll try to go quickly about it and hopefully we'll just raise some questions and then we'll be able to have a rich discussion afterwards. But I'll talk about change in the region, and I still want to see the countries as fledgling democracies. I don't want to give up yet. There's still something happening. This is hopefully a hiccup that in the future will happen. This kind of change doesn't happen overnight. It takes decades, it takes generations. So this is a bump. Let's wait and see what happens. There are difficulties. I also want to talk about people talking that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, some countries had market economies. I think this is a myth. I'm going to try to debunk that. And then I'll talk about the need for market economy in the region. My assertion is that the Arab Spring resulted from absence of political freedoms, absence of democracies, but also absence of market economies, and I'll try to show you that, and then through that discuss what is needed to have a market economy, and then I'll select one sector, youth. We can go over with women, about a lot of other sectors in society, but I'll select youth because I think it is the most important sector right now in the region. All right, it works. This is a picture from Yemen, the National Dialogue Conference, and I just want to bring it up to discuss the idea of fledgling democracies. 565 delegates meeting over six months to develop the form of the country, what kind of constitution, etc. There is that promise of hope. There is that promise of things will change. To have these people in Yemen, a country that has a lot more arms than individuals, a country that the central government doesn't project its power outside of the main cities. But to have a process moving on, there is hope. I'm not saying it will succeed, but there is hope for moving forward. If you see Tunisia, with the development of a new constitution, the struggle between labor and the Islamists, and what's going on. But there is a process moving forward that still is hopeful, but at the same time, political assassinations, Yemen, Tunisia, Libya, Syria and Libya themselves are going through wars. There's a threat of disintegration. So there are difficulties. It still will take time, but hopefully at the end of the day, they will succeed and it will work. I said at the beginning, but I want to repeat here, that the Arab Spring started because of the absence of political freedom. There was a lot of frustration. They could not express themselves, so they went out on the streets and expressed that. But it was also because of the absence of market economy. The biggest signs were karama in the Arab world was about dignity. Dignity comes through political representation, through political freedom, but also through economic freedom and the ability to succeed and to be able to provide for your family in a good way. So there was a lot of talk pre-Arab Revolution about the Arab world. Some have gone through economic reforms, and they were called economic reforms. But there are myths, and I'll discuss three of them very quickly. The first one is that if you have private enterprise, then it is a market economy. Well, they're not the same. I'm sure this is a room full of experts that understands this, but I want to make sure we all understand and why. If you go to Egypt, like I used to go, you see appearances of wealth, appearances of affluence. There's a lot more than used to be 10 or 15 or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. However, anybody that goes there also saw how much poverty increased. So the growth or the reforms or whatever happened was absolutely not inclusive. There were, between 2004 to 2009, 191 state-owned enterprises were privatized. So there was private enterprise. There was private ownership. Socialism of Nasser had disappeared. But still, I assert there was no market economy in the country. Second, people talk about the business community, and I put business between two parentheses as if it's a monolith. We have, the business community will do this. The business community should do that. They do not see the difference between state-owned enterprises and everything in between until you reach the small and medium enterprise sector. These are very different constituencies, very different interests, very different objectives. And then we have crony capitalists in Egypt and the Arab world, there's full of them. And then you have the entrepreneurs, the informal sector. These are completely different constituencies, so please do not see the private sector, the business community, as a monolith. And the final myth I want to talk about is that government hinders market economic reform. If government just got out of the way, we will have a real market economy. Well, absolutely not true. Without the government providing the proper legal and regulatory environment for growth, without the government making sure there's antitrust law so we don't have monopolies, consumer rights, rule of law, contract adjudication, the government is an absolute necessity to have a market economy. So we need a government, but we need transparency, accountability, and we'll talk about it. Otherwise, it's the rule of the jungle. We're not going to have a real market economy. I know these are probably known to you, but I wanted to make sure we're on the same page when we're discussing this. Next is the idea of democracy. So the same institutions, the same infrastructure that ensures democracy, ensures democratic behavior, also ensures a market economy. They're the same institutions, one and the same, they're inseparable. The same court that will protect your civil rights, the same court that will protect you from government intrusion in your life, will also protect your property rights. These are important institutions and we can go through them one by one, but rule of law is a good example. If you don't have rule of law that protects you as a citizen, it will not protect you as a business also at the same time. We talk about the institutions. I don't know how many of you have heard about the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto. Fantastic research that he's done in Peru and elsewhere. But how many of you, by show of hand, have heard of Mohamed Bouazizi? Mohamed Bouazizi is the entrepreneur, not a labor person, an entrepreneur who self-immolated in Tunisia because he was not able to register his business, because he was not able to provide for his family. And so he self-immolated and killed, and he died, and many people think it became this spark, sorry for the pun, for the Arab Spring. Well, Hernando de Soto found 63 Arab entrepreneurs who did the same. 63 other Arab entrepreneurs who burned themselves. Some passed away, some survived, but what he says is that the frustration that led these people, the 63 people, to self-immolate around the same time that Mohamed Bouazizi did, is the main reason for the frustration in the Arab world, main reason for the Arab Spring. Property rights. They're not able to own property. 92% of Egyptians right now, 92% hold their properties without legal rights to them. He estimates, and this was at the congressional hearing, Hernando de Soto said that this, in Egypt alone, the informal sector owns about $347 billion worth of property that's not registered. They own it extra-legally. And if you compare that to $4.8 billion IMF loan that they're discussing, compared to $347 billion, if you compare that to the Gulf infusion of funds to Egypt right now of $13 billion, you see the amount of what he called dead capital or dead asset, $347 billion. That's a lot of asset that's not used to obtain a loan, for the small business to be able to register and grow, to hire more people, create employment, pay taxes, and this at least has three benefits. Number one, informal sector operators themselves are citizens. They need rights. When you have a business, when you register a business, you have a right. You can go and vote, and you can go and participate in government. Number two, the informal sector in the Arab world, as it is in the rest of the world, the Islamic world overall, but in the rest of the world, has disproportionate number of women. It's a fact. And so empowering the informal sector is a way to empower women at the same time. Empower them economically. They're not dependent on their husbands, not dependent on their fathers, not dependent on their children. They're independent so they can be politically empowered. And finally, when you have informal sector operators register and have a business, then they're able, like I said, to have employees, to grow, to pay taxes. And as the government collects taxes from them, that skewed accountability system, relationship where the people are accountable to the government because they take care of them, is reversed. So now the government is accountable to the people, and a tax base is absolutely necessary for that. Hernando de Soto also conducted with his team of researchers, and at the same hearing in the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, he estimated that for an Egyptian business to register, You need 86 steps, over 8,000 Egyptian pounds, and 189 days. That's about half the average income of an Egyptian, the 8,000 pounds, and more than a half a year. How many people are able to register? Millions and millions of small businesses in Egypt are unable to register, unable to become legal, unable to participate in the economy, unable to participate in the political system because they're illegal. That's a huge number, just imagine. This is a picture, one of my favorite pictures out of Al-Ahram, when in 1959, Gamal Abdel Nasser, if you all know, he's the Arab leader of the 50s and 60s, was reviewing a military parade. Then somebody just popped out of the platform underneath and asked him for a job. He doesn't need handout. I just want a job. Now it's up to you to imagine if that's pre-planned or a conspiracy or just by himself popped out. That's not the subject of our discussion here. But he wanted a job. Famously, Gamal Abdel Nasser gave him a secure job and said every Egyptian, every Arab citizen deserves a job. It's a right. The government has to provide jobs for everybody. Fantastic. Great. Government responsibility to provide jobs for everybody. So the government provides jobs, government provides subsidies, okay? And then who's dependent on whom right now? The Arab social contract makes the citizen dependent on the government. So where's the accountability? This way. The accountability is that the citizen is accountable. If we don't like you, you have to prove that you're loyal to the government. That's where accountability is. The key, in my opinion, right now is to switch that accountability relationship to where people pay taxes, you collect the tax, so you're accountable to me. That's just a natural way of accountability that's absent. What's scary right now, and I know I started with an optimistic tone, is that things will still change, is that there are more populist demands right now. Sudan is on fire, and I'm no fan of Bashir. But the demands are for more subsidies, the demands are for more state employment, not the other way around. It's scary, there's more of a populist goal. Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, everywhere there are more demands for subsidies and government jobs. And until today, the idea is to go out to vote, yes, but to vote for what? To vote for a good government that will take care of us. I don't know how many of you know, Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood got a plurality of the vote in Egypt. Not all the people who vote for them were Muslim Brotherhood. They voted for them, and I asked a lot of people who were secular, I knew them. He said, well, they fear God. They will take care of us. So the idea is to bring somebody who will take care of you into government, not to bring somebody and they're accountable, they work for us, and if they don't work for us, we'll fire them. So bring somebody who takes care of us, and that's a skewed accountability relationship. We talked about the Nasser social contract, and that influenced even the monarchies in the Gulf monarchies everywhere. Take a look, I think I have a laser here. Take a look at the Gulf countries of Bahrain, for example, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. About 80% of employment in the countries are public sector employment. These are people who are employed by the state. And in these countries and some other countries, the government jobs pay more than the private sector jobs. If you add to that generous subsidies, oil, gas is subsidized, sometimes food is subsidized a lot, how can any government be accountable to its people? How can the government be accountable to the citizens? Add to that also, small enterprises, small and medium enterprises do not have access to capital to grow. About 8% of available bank loans go to small and medium enterprises. The rest go to the big business. 1 in 5 small and medium enterprises has access to a line of credit or a loan. Just quickly to go through this. If you see the one on the left, that the percentage of total employment of the economy by SMEs, and the one to the right is how much they contribute to GDP. In the United States, between 1980 and 2005, all of the new net jobs, that's the jobs you create minus the jobs you lose, all of them were generated from entrepreneurial SMEs. That's 5 years or less. If you compare that to the Middle East, is nothing like that, nothing. Employment is all state or major corporations, major companies. This is also one of my favorite slides to say, with all these state jobs, we think of citizens that are usually given to the guys, to the men. Women do not have access to these good jobs. Women do not have access to big corporate jobs. They're shut out because of from labor participation because of cultural and social barriers. So in the Middle East, women labor market participation is probably the lowest in the world at only 26%. However, if you take a look at the tech sector over the internet, it's 35%, so that's 3 times the global average. I see an opening for women empowerment here. I tend to be a feminist, but so that's in a different kind of way. But I see an opening here for empowering women through entrepreneurs, through creating opportunity for entrepreneurship in the IT sector. That's just numbers. Numbers don't lie. In a study done about impediments or hurdles to enterprise, in the why don't you establish your own business? If you see some of the highest, some of the highest are society doesn't accept it. My family and my society doesn't accept it. And 1 is the highest and 0 is the lowest. So 1 is impossible, 0 is least challenging. It's not even acceptable. Why? Because you get a government job, job security, social prestige. I had a Saudi friend who told me, you know what, this guy wants to come and marry my daughter. Honestly, this is a true story. He wants to marry my daughter. He's starting his own business. Who is secure for my daughter? No, I want somebody with a good government job, secure. He will take care of her. There's a stigma about entrepreneurship in the region. So not even accepted. Lack of prestige and family, and then if you see fear of failure is so huge also in the Middle East. They don't know that you start business, you fail. How many times did Bill Gates fail? How many times did others fail before they succeed? You fail once, shame on you, shame on your family, shame on your tribe, shame on everything. So there's no, the community doesn't accept, the society doesn't accept the ideas of entrepreneurship. Also, we talk about economic participation as important, but economic participation leads to political participation. When you have interests, you need to defend them. So economic participation, first of all, you're empowered. You get to participate more. But second, you have interests you need to defend. But it has to be done in an organized kind of way around constituency or constituencies for small enterprises, big enterprises, informal sector. They need to be organized around business associations. And when you have constituencies competing for interest, that's what real democracy is about, not just elections. It's what happens in between elections. I'm not going to go a lot through this. I hope you can ask Carl Gershman, who's in my opinion one of the best, if not the best, expert on civil society's participation in democracy. But associations are one of these civil society organization types. So businesses have to organize around associations and they have to fight for their interests. Pointing with this to that. The Arab Spring, the change, and we talk about markets and change as the subject of this panel, was driven by young, energetic, educated Arabs, but they lack jobs. That's what's missing. So if they don't get jobs, we don't think change will work. It's about creating jobs and opportunities for jobs or businesses for them. This is also a favorite slide of mine. If you take a look at the darker, is still working? Yeah. If the darker numbers, that's between 15 to 29. This is the youth bulge in the Arab world. This is for Yemen, but the rest of the Arab world is very, very similar. 30% is in a 15-year group. If you add another 15 before and after, you know what a resource the Arab world has when it comes to youth who are at the age where they're the most productive. They can work. If you take a look at the Asian tigers and what the youth bulge did for them, it's amazing. However, right now there are reasons for instability. The youth are fodder for terrorism that affects their countries, their region, and the entire world. It's a resource that's wasted. It's just something that has to be addressed and has to be addressed quickly. Youth unemployment. The one on the left is North Africa. The one on the right is the rest of the Middle East. It's the highest in the world for youth. The highest youth unemployment in the world. Isabel is a much better expert on this. I hope she has some to say about it in her presentation. just quickly about what youth does and what youth unemployment does, but this is my final slide, and it's just really distresses me. This is country versus unemployment, and this is by education. So if you take a look at Tunisia, if you don't have an education, if you have less than basic education, 5.7% unemployment. If you're highly educated, 22.9%. Take a look at Saudi Arabia. It's not such a bad unemployment rate, 5.4% compared to Tunisia. But if you're uneducated, you're pretty much guaranteed employment. But if you're educated, 11.3%. The trend is there, except for West Bank and Gaza, everybody's unemployed. But the rest of it, take a look at this number. Tell me this doesn't bother you. Tell me this doesn't scare you. They educate them, they have these graduates who are unemployed, yet these countries bring expats for skilled labor. It's just a recipe for disaster, recipe for crisis, recipe for explosion. The education system has to be reformed. The graduates have to respond to market needs, and for that to happen, the private sector has to be engaged in designing the curricula. Without that engagement, you'll have graduates who become problems instead of responding to the market needs. I promise I'm done.
Take your time.
Just this is my final slide. I just want to, with all that depressing news, I want to give you, hopefully that change will still happen. Positive change will be good. For the region, it is needed. We need to continue to push for free and fair elections. Without them, nothing will happen. These are absolutely needed. We need to strengthen political parties. SIPE is one of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy. Like I said, Mr. Carl Gershman, the president of NED, will be here. But other institutes work with political parties, work with parliaments. All of these are absolutely necessary. We need them. We need labor rights. We need to strengthen labor unions. But without a market economy, the youth of the Arab world, the youth of the Middle East, that will not have the dignity that they need. Dignity comes through political participation, political freedoms, but without a market economy that pushes for change, that empowers them, that gives them the dignity, I don't think it will happen, but it's still very possible if we focus on it. I thank you very much, and if you have any questions, this is my email address. Thank you very much.
I think that was a great presentation to get us started. There are many questions. In fact, I have several, Abdul Wahab, and inshallah, when we start the round of questions, we will come to that. Our next speaker is Isabel Coleman from the Council on Foreign Relations. Isabel is an expert in political economy of the Middle East, democratization, civil society, economic development, educational reform, and gender issues. She is the author and co-author of numerous books, including Pathways to Freedom, Political and Economic Lessons from Democratic Transitions, and Restoring the Balance, a Middle East strategy for the next President of the United States. She may also want to tell us how far she feels that proposed next strategy was embraced by the President for whom this long memo was written. Isabel will be speaking to us about markets and democratic change, and she will draw on her wide experience and knowledge of other societies, other transitional societies, which include, as I said earlier, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, Thailand, all over the world. What do they have? What lessons do they have for the greater Middle East, and how some of those lessons may be applicable in our region? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you, Ambassador Haqqani, for inviting me here, and thank you, Abdul Wahab, for a great opening, because I think you really covered a lot of ground. And what I'm going to do is pick up on some of the themes that you've mentioned and talk at more length about some of those, and also introduce a couple of other ideas into the mix, and I look forward to the Q&A session. It is interesting to talk about markets in the Middle East. We always tend to focus on the politics and not the markets. It's not been the most dynamic region economically, certainly. Of course, there are wealthy countries, but they have gotten rich on oil wealth, and I think oil has played a very pernicious role in that part of the world in enabling many of the ill effects that Abdul Wahab has just gone through. And now, though, when you look at the revolutions that have spread across the region, they have really not been in the oil-producing Gulf countries. They've been in the non-oil producing states. I mean, Egypt has oil and gas, but is a net importer. Libya, of course, has enormous natural resources, but has not fully exploited those resources for a variety of reasons, has a lot to do with its political structure and sanctions and everything else over the decades. And Tunisia is not a resource-rich country. And so it is interesting that you've seen the revolutions really take off in those countries, Syria too. And yet, when we look at the region, this is a region really going through economic crisis right now. The war in Syria has destroyed its economy and is spilling over into neighboring economies, is hurting Turkey's economy right now. Lebanon is very fragile. Iraq has not rebounded. Egypt, of course, is dependent on tourism for a big portion of employment and for foreign earnings, and tourism has been badly hurt by unrest in Egypt. Also, receipts from the Suez Canal, and that there's a lot of consternation about security and transit through Suez. Tunisia also dependent very highly on tourism and foreign direct investment, and you've seen both foreign direct investment in Egypt and Tunisia go down. You've seen tourism hurt badly by the unrest. And Libya, of course, is experiencing lots of work stoppages right now that is hurting its oil production, and 95% of its budget comes from oil. So this is a region that's going through crisis. But one of the lessons from this book that Hussein Haqqani was referring to earlier is that economic reform really comes out of a time of crisis. If you look at countries that have gone through deep reforms, it has more often come out of crisis than it has out of a period of growth. And this has, of course, implications for a country like China, which is chugging along, but you wonder what will happen if it really, the growth hits the brakes and you have more of a crisis situation in that country. But from the countries that we looked at in this book, I mean, we did a briefing when the book came out with the folks at the South African embassy who said, it wasn't just sanctions, and it wasn't just the fact that our athletes couldn't compete in Europe. It was the fact that our economy was tanking. It was the crisis of the economic urgency that really brought the different parties to the table. Brazil, Mexico, their reforms really came out of the Latin American debt crisis. Indonesia really came out of the Asian financial crisis and created an opportunity. And when I look across the Middle East today, I also see opportunity. I mean, Abdul Wahab talked about all of the really negative problems that the region is facing, but it is also a moment, and it may be a moment in time, but it's a generational opportunity to capture from this crisis some deep-seated changes that could happen. And those changes, I think, that are required are to move from this state-centered, state-controlled economy to a more bottom-up private sector economy, to decentralize. And I'm going to talk a little bit at more length about that. Some of the countries that we discuss in the book have used decentralization as a way to really deepen democracy and deepen reforms at a local level, to create a new dynamic where people are no longer looking to the state to provide everything for them. I mean, that last slide that Abdul Wahab showed is very important to understand that when you come out of university with a college degree, the expectation is that the state will provide a job for you. It's the best job to get because it comes with higher wages, it comes with benefits. And in Egypt, the statistics are remarkable. People with college degrees are waiting upwards of 8-9 years to get a government bureaucratic job. When you have the lower levels of education, as he pointed out, You can't afford to wait around. You can't afford to be unemployed. So you hustle and you start a business. It's an informal business for the most part, as we've talked about already. You don't own your own property necessarily. You don't have title. You don't have rights to operate that business. But you do it anyway because you have to make a living. And Mohamed Bouazizi, who Abdul Wahab mentioned, the street vendor in Tunisia, remember what it was that created his sense of desperation. His street cart was taken away from him. He had no rights to that property, and it was everything he had. And when you think about the informal economy in these countries, 50+% in Egypt of non-agricultural employment is in the informal economy. 80% of entrepreneurs operate in the informal economy. And it's a very insecure environment because you don't own your property, you don't have title, and you can't leverage it for growth. Subsidies, an opportunity to replace a very bloated and inefficient subsidy system with something that's much more targeted to the neediest and less corrupt and more efficient. And to create new trade partnerships. The Middle East is a region of the world. North Africa has the lowest level of intra-regional trade, even lower than sub-Saharan Africa, which has very low intra-regional trade on a global basis. But you look at Latin America, you look at East Asia, intra-regional trade is 3-4 times what it is in the Middle East. And you have closed borders, you have long historical grievances, but maybe this is an opportunity for some of those things to change. To unleash also civil society, which I think has to be a partner in this change. And we've already had a little bit of discussion around that, but really figuring out the ways that civil society can be empowered to partner with both the private sector and with government to make, deepen and broaden some of the changes we're talking about, and to unleash the capability of youth. Youth in the region, and we just saw the scary numbers. Well, it shouldn't be scary. Youth is a source of innovation and growth. Europe, which is right across the Mediterranean from North Africa, is struggling with a significantly aging population and population decline in many countries. And there's no reason at all that North Africa should not be the workhorse of Europe going forward, should not be a labor pool for Europe, a source of jobs and employment and innovation. Youth offers so much potential, and yet it's not. Companies from Europe are loath to invest in North Africa, even though they're in the same time zone, even though they share some same language capabilities. There's Francophone Tunisia. You've got long historical roots between Libya and Italy. There's a lot of baggage there too, but there's some language affinity with Morocco, of course, and Algeria and Tunisia with Francophone Europe. And you've got Germany, of course, is looking to offshore many of its labor-intensive industries because it's actually running out of workers, and it has its own issues about importing labor, and it should be a really symbiotic relationship, much more than it is today. And so I see some of these things as opportunities. And, it's not all doom and gloom. And the fact is, in the 7 years prior to Egypt's revolution, Egypt was actually growing in excess of 5-6% a year. And there were emerging market experts who had coined the term civets like a little animal, as the new brick. This was Colombia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Egypt, Turkey, South Africa, before South Africa got attached to the BRICS. But, Egypt had a lot of economic potential, and it was being put into that next emerging market growth category, and people were looking at it. You did have privatization that had occurred. It had driven the stock market in some respects. But, of course, we know that a lot of it was undermined by crony capitalism, and Abdul Wahab has already talked about that. But the issue today for Egypt is, how do you not throw the baby out with the bathwater? How do you not reject a market approach because it is so closely associated with the NDP and with Mubarak, both Hosni Mubarak and Gamal Mubarak, who at one point were deeply reviled. Perhaps they're not so reviled today as they were in Egypt, but still, a lot of suspicion about those market reforms and how the gains of those market reforms were very unequally distributed. How do you capture the benefits of the market reforms without the downside of the crony capitalism that enriched some at the expense of others? And it is true when you look at poverty rates that while poverty rates declined decade on decade in Egypt, starting in the late 1990s, those poverty rates actually started to tick up again. So you had economic growth at a time of also rising poverty. Where is Egypt's growth and potential going to come from? Well, there are just a couple things I want to talk about. One is subsidy reform, and I'm sure you've heard the need for Egypt to go through subsidy reform. But is this a moment, again, an opportunity? Does crisis present an opportunity for Egypt to actually undertake what everybody in the country seems to know is an urgent reform to do? Now, subsidy reform has been on the books for almost 4 decades in Egypt. I mean, you go back to Sadat trying to undertake food subsidy reforms back in 1977, and his government nearly fell. You had riots in the street, you had people killed, and he backed away from it. And in fact, this has made subsequent governments really allergic to the idea of subsidy reform. But it has become almost unbearable now in Egypt, with so much of the resources of the country channeled into subsidies, both fuel subsidies, which are not even going to the poorest of the poor, they're really going to the middle class and to inefficient businesses, and fuel subsidies and also other subsidies. And a lot of that, the subsidy program really encourages corruption. You see a lot of the Egyptian fuel, subsidized fuel on the black market in Gaza for sale, for example. And there's a whole underground smuggling network that takes much of that subsidized fuel outside the country. And it's true in Libya, too, where you have subsidized fuel. So I think there is a consensus in the country that fuel subsidies must occur, and then after that, other subsidy reforms, but no one's willing to do it. And when I talked about crisis as a driver of change, I mean, Egypt is on the verge of crisis, but then never actually gets there. And it partly is because it has wealthy Gulf neighbors who have stepped in and rescued it from crisis, most recently to the tune of $20 billion. And when you see the figures that Abdul Wahab is putting up about, the government employment in countries like Saudi, 80% of the population is on the government payroll. These are not benefactors that I think are going to drive a lot of reform in Egypt. That's not what they're interested in. And I do wonder, is Saudi going to wake up at one point and say, we're not sure that we like what we bought here in Egypt because it's expensive. This will be very, very expensive for Saudi to keep up at these levels. And Kuwait and the UAE, all of which have been channeling funds into Egypt's central bank. So the crisis is going to come at some point. And, it may be a softer landing than if Egypt had just run out of money and the IMF had forced changes. But I don't think that the Gulf countries can, in perpetuity, fund Egypt at the level at which it's funding it today. It's just they have their own economic reform needs. I mean, Saudi is the largest subsidizer of fuel on a per capita basis, had subsidy reform plans in the works before the Arab revolutions rattled the government, and they backed away from it. But, they recognize that they need to go down this path, and I think at some point Egypt will too. The second thing I want to talk about is decentralization. One of the lessons, again, from the book that I've referred to already is that countries going through transition can really broaden and deepen democracy by decentralizing to district and local levels. And decentralization, of course, is not a panacea, but it has some benefits. And when I look at Egypt's case, the Muslim Brotherhood made many mistakes. But from my view, one of the most egregious things it did, and one of perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back, is when they appointed as the governor of Luxor a member of Gamma Islamiyah. And if remember, it was an organization that had been a terrorist organization. and that had been responsible for killing scores of German tourists back in the 1990s in a terrible attack in Luxor. Now, Luxor is a region of the country that lives and breathes on tourism. And it was such a personal affront to the people of Luxor that somebody from this organization, Gama Islamiyah, could be appointed the governor of their governorate. And, yes, Gama Islamiyah has renounced violence, but people would say, not enough, and that history and that baggage was just way too much for people to handle. I mean, imagine in this country, Washington appointing the governor of Alaska, or, you pick your state. And then everything comes from the center in Egypt. Your governor doesn't have any type of budgetary control. It's all allocated at a very central level down to the most local level. And, you can't tell me that bureaucrats sitting in Cairo understand whether they need a school or a bridge in this province in Aswan, far, far away from the capital. When I look at what a country like Indonesia went through after its financial crisis, one of the things that it did is it devolved power. It devolved budgetary power and some political power to more local levels. And it allowed for a greater grassroots participation on how resources are allocated. It gives people a reason to buy into what's going on in their own community. It enabled greater budgetary transparency. Okay, our grant here for education is this amount, so let's see where it's being spent and how it's being spent. So it has allowed for much greater buy-in from people about a political process. The last thing I would say is the role of NGOs and the role that they play in bolstering this process of reform. And it can't all happen just by government reform. Civil society has to be a partner. And again, I look at the examples from Mexico and from Indonesia and Brazil and others that we addressed in the book. Civil society played such an important role in taking government reforms, both political and economic, and holding the state accountable for what they have said they are going to do. And in a case like Indonesia, Indonesia suffered from terrible corruption. It still does, but in many ways it has civil society has played an active role in reducing corruption, and you can look at its, Transparency International rankings, and it's gotten much better in Indonesia. And it's been done in a variety of different ways, even at a very grassroots level through websites like I Paid a Bribe, which actually when you're pulled over and stopped and you're asked to, give me a little bakshish for letting you off on this ticket, you go on the website and you say, I was asked to pay a bribe, and you put in the officer's badge and name number. And these are the types of very grassroots local mechanisms that are having people say, that's not the right way for the system to work. Up through more institutionalized processes where you have transparency on the budget. Budgets are published at a local level so people understand what they are due, and you have citizen groups who track then where the money goes and how it is spent for greater accountability. And then, of course, the role of the media in exposing corruption and talking about corruption and being a partner in combating corruption. And in countries like Mexico and Brazil, you've seen a huge uptick in awareness and involvement and engagement on these types of issues. Just a couple other things I wanted to mention. Rule of law, which is something Abdul Wahab mentioned too, is so critical on this. And this again is where civil society can come into play and play a very important role in holding, again, government accountable for changing laws to strengthen rule of law, and then making sure that there is consistency and transparency. One of the most discouraging trends that we've seen in Egypt is the lack of a strong NGO law that enables civil society to function in this partnership way. And there are many examples I can give you of organizations, whether it's NED or whether it's, SIPE has been operating in Egypt for a long time. I'd be curious whether you've had any problems operating there as an NGO, but many organizations that I have worked with have had their money held up, have had their registration held up. They're not allowed to work in the way that they were originally told that they could work, and there's great suspicion in society because of the very high-profile cases that have occurred in recent years where people are just unsure, foreign NGOs, are we allowed to work with them? And this is coming not only from the Muslim Brotherhood government, but in fact, really from the military, which is deeply suspicious of NGOs in that country and has really hindered their ability to form and to operate. And there's one group that I know that's been working exactly on one of the most urgent issues, youth unemployment, doing soft skills training and helping connect youth with jobs. And their budget has been held by the government for 2 years, and they've been unable to access funds that have been transferred into the country. And so, you see, the government is not working in a partnership way to enable civil society to function in a constructive fashion. And then just, one more thing on entrepreneurship, because at the end of the day, this is a part of the world where both the rich oil countries which spend a lot of their oil wealth on employing people, and you saw the numbers from Abdul Wahab, and in the case of Saudi, when the unrest started, they increased government employment and the price at which they're buying people, in effect, through a $140 billion handout to people that resulted in the hiring of many more government employees and wage increases for government employees and additional subsidies and benefits for government employees. But at some point, the money's going to run out, and there is a sense already that we need to think about that next stage and that next level, and there are glimmers of groups and efforts and initiatives that are trying to build entrepreneurship across the region and trying to encourage it at the schools level, trying to encourage a different mindset. And this is now, I think, a fertile time in which those efforts can be nurtured, expanded, enhanced, as people recognize that it is just simply no longer business as usual. Thank you.
Now we come to the discussion section, and I would like to start off the discussion with a couple of points that were raised. There's so much to absorb from both the presentations, so many facts that have come out that we need to go over. So I'll just ask a couple of questions and then I'll open it to the floor, and what I would request is that everybody raise their hand. Once I recognize you, a mic will come to you. Identify yourself and your affiliation and ask your question. Abdul Wahab, I want to start with a couple of very basic questions. For example, you talked about how in Saudi Arabia there's a lot of skilled and educated people who are unemployed, and yet Saudi Arabia continues to import skilled labor. Why is that?
It's a very good question, Hussein. Is this working?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just want to say, but everybody can ask a question except two people here cannot ask questions. So my two colleagues, just facetiously, Nate Grubman and Ricky Chan, who know exactly what's in my brain. They work with me. They know everything. Without them, I wouldn't be able to say anything. Nate is now the assistant editor of the Journal of Democracy, the top journal on democracy in the world. Rick still works for me, but nobody can hire him, so thank you very much. That's a superb question. The reason is that the educational systems in the Arab world, since the Arab Revolution of Nasser in the 50s and 60s and went on, prepared a student to become a good government employee, not to go respond to a market need, not respond to what's needed in the market. The market has grown, the needs for the markets have grown, and places like India and the Philippines and other places have prepared their graduates for those needs so they can fill these jobs that are now needed in the Gulf countries, while their own graduates cannot. They're not prepared for it. And another reason is that the educational system is sacrosanct. Nobody can touch it. It's political, it's security related, so you can't reform it. Talk about education reform in these countries is very political, and you cannot do it. While there's the biggest need for reform is in the educational system, so that they graduate based on what's needed in the market, as we do here. You know, you go to where are the jobs available, you study, not through rote education. And then for that to happen, Hussein, the private sector has to be engaged in these reforms. They have to tell them what's needed, so the training happens based on what the private sector needs.
So basically, the reason why I asked that question, I did have some idea of the answer, is that actually political reform, educational reform, economic reform are also connected to educational reform.
Yes.
That is very, very comprehensively and seriously needed, because if thousands of young people are being educated with only one thing in mind, that you will get a job in government and that's what you're being trained for, and they are not really suited for market-related jobs, and then the market starts to grow, it may not necessarily benefit the societies where the market is expanding.
Absolutely.
Right. The question I have, and by the way, you may want to answer the question that Isabel asked about SIPE doing, or how
Yes.
are you doing in Egypt?
Yes, I mean, this is a public event, but SIPE has a lot of things going for it. Number one, we're not registered with the Ministry of Social Affairs and International Development. We're registered with the ministry that regulates the business. So our registration went through easily, and we're working. And we actually have a grant from USA to be able to do our work, one of the few organizations that continues to receive funds and do its work. The other is that our office in Egypt, as our offices all over the world, are run by all locals, no expats at all. I know some other organizations have locals who have also been taken to court and arrested, but the government, the intelligence services came to us, questioned us, went through our books. We pay our taxes, we pay our unemployment portion and social security portion. So it's not that we're not under pressure, we're under tremendous pressure. But so far, we've been able to do our work because we've done it.
Because part of the crackdown on the NGOs, especially in Egypt, has been kind of in a very nationalistic context, like, you know, somehow this is bringing foreign influence and all that. So not
rhetorical.
Rhetorical
A lot of
nationalism, of course. A lot of, yeah.
And just to add to that, I mean, an Egyptian friend asked, who is a civil society activist, he says, if we send an Egyptian NGO to the United States and you don't want to know where the funding is coming from, would you allow it to work in the United States? That's rhetorical. It's two different, they said, comparing apples and oranges, but there is a lot of, like, exactly
even,
nationalistic
well, of course,
rhetoric.
I hope you told them that technically there wouldn't be a problem at all.
Not if they receive funding from
Yeah.
unknown people. So you have to know where the funding is. It has to be transparent and open, and that's okay in Egypt too. It has to be transparent.
Okay,
and
Isabel,
open.
just to get the discussion rolling, I can see lots of people who are anxious to ask questions. You know, a couple of things that struck me in your presentation: the low level of intra-regional trade in the Middle East, especially in North Africa, Europe's reluctance to invest in North Africa despite the potential advantages. Any explanation?
Well, you know, the low level of intra-regional trade has to do with historical hostilities, and you've had closed borders, you know, between Morocco, Algeria, Libya. I mean, you've had, you know, I was in Morocco going to Libya last year. I had to fly through Paris. You know, this is crazy, but it is the way that it has been. You've had very intense political rivalries that have resulted in literally closed borders in that part of the world. You do have some movement of workers. You know, the one source of positive income for Egypt has been remittances from Egyptians working in the Gulf, but you know, overall, it's not nearly as much as you would think it would be. Libya right now has the fastest growing economy in the world. It did last year. It grew by over 100%, And in the next, 5 years, if oil production continues, it should grow in the sort of 20% to 25% range. On the books are somewhere around $500 billion of infrastructure investment that should occur in Libya. It has the money to pay for it. It has the need. It doesn't have the people. This is a country of 5 million people to build all of that infrastructure. Well, its neighbor Egypt certainly has the employment, the labor force to do that. And yet, who do you see working in Libya? Chinese, and Turkish workers. But you really, these are the big macro things that we should be thinking about when we think about how to employ all of these Egyptians. There should be programs in place to train them up in construction management and techniques for doing some of this infrastructure building. And I just want to make a quick comment on the NGOs in Egypt. Some of the NGOs I'm talking about are absolutely local in that their management is local, their people are local, and they follow all the rules. There's complete transparency on where the money comes from, but it's coming from overseas, and it's just, being held up. So.
Okay. Turkey was mentioned, although albeit in the context of Turks working in Libya. To what extent do the changes that have occurred in Turkey over the last few years, in particular, the opening up of the Turkish market, the Islamists actually embracing democracy and turning out okay within the democratic and the market context, to what extent does that provide, for want of a better word, a model for the for the Arab countries of the Middle East? Both of you, quick answers, and then we open up to the floor.
Well, I would look at Erdogan's visit to the region, his first visit after the Arab uprisings, and he landed in Tunisia and was treated like a rock star. And his message, I think, really resonated, which is you can do well under democracy and really follow a capitalist model, free market model. When he got to Egypt, he was also met like a rock star, but when he started talking about democracy and secularism, the audience went pretty dead on him, and they didn't even drive him back to the airport when he was done. So, I think one of the bright spots in all of this is that the Islamists in Egypt who remain, you may not like it, but they remain a very powerful force. They were largely in favor of a market economy. But their commitment to democracy, I think, was perhaps not as deep as some would like, and is certainly, I would argue, been shaken now with events that have occurred. And so I think that there's deep suspicion, particularly in Egypt, about the Turkish, commitment to democracy and secularism in particular.
A secularism that thrives alongside a religious conservatism that is rising.
Absolutely.
So the two can coexist, and that's where I find the Turkish model particularly interesting.
Yeah, if I just add a little bit, I agree with everything that's said here, with a huge difference of what Turkish society is and what Turkish economy is compared to the rest of the Arab world. If you go back to the 1940s and 50s, Egypt and Turkey were in similar. You can compare them. You can say which one is like the other, etc. But over the past 70 to 80 years, things have changed dramatically. The number one export from Turkey to Europe is not vegetables, it's not fruits, it's cars. Turkey is an industrialized state that went through a democratization process. The Arab world is not. The Arab world, and the second thing, very controversial, but Islam in Turkey is not like Islam in Egypt. They're completely two different things. I mean, I'm no Turkish expert. Ihsan is here, maybe he'll talk about it in the second panel. But I see different societies that accept different things, that how Islam runs their lives are different. I know there are problems that many Turks see with the current government. I know that Turks see problems with the AK party. But it's not like the Muslim Brotherhood. It's nowhere like the Muslim Brotherhood. They're two different societies. And if we want to use Turkey as a model to emulate the market reforms that happened in Turkey, not the way people live. They're two different societies.
Okay, good. So we've got lots of thoughts here, and I'm sure you guys have lots of comments and questions. Please raise your hands, and I will get you all on board. Microphone to the front row first. First question, and then right after you can move it.
Michael Kurtzig, formerly of U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'm very curious, Isabel, about your comment about importing more labor from North Africa into Europe. The Europeans are having a hell of a problem with the Muslim youth in their countries, whether it's in Paris, or whether it's in England, or whether what Mrs. Merkel said recently, that they do not assimilate. It's a big, big problem for us. And you hear about problems in Europe. Why would any country in its right mind import even more youth when the population growth of the Europeans themselves is very low and the population growth of Muslims is very high? Some people are saying in 50 years Europe will be a Muslim region. I think it's a very scary proposition. Thank you.
I think you misunderstood what I said. I was talking about the aging of Europe, the decline in population, and its reluctance to import labor, and therefore North Africa should be a place for offshoring, for investment in North Africa for labor-intensive industries. Frankly, like auto production, who's exporting cars from Turkey to Europe? It's German auto manufacturers who invested, and Japanese who invested in Turkey. And I didn't answer your question. Why is Europe reluctant to invest in North Africa? Well, Europe has invested in North Africa, and France and Germany are the two largest investors. Germany today is the largest investor now, has eclipsed the United States in Egypt and in Tunisia, Germany and France. So you have seen investment, but not nearly as much investment as you would think if you were landing from Mars and looking at this situation and saying, okay, you're right, geographically you're right next door, you have language and time zone benefits, and yet you're putting your factories in Bangladesh. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is that on a productivity basis, labor in North Africa is expensive. It's not cheap. It's very expensive compared to Bangladesh and India and places like that on a productivity basis. And so this gets back to education and productivity levels. And then the second thing is that there are perceptions of instability, terrorism, and lack of rule of law and transparency. And all of what we're talking about is related. It's economic reform, political reform, educational reform, and it needs to happen together. So I was not saying open the floodgates to Europe, but I am saying it should be a very synergistic relationship.
Again, in the front row. People in the back rows can raise their hands.
Including you two.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Yulia Spanchak, and I'm based here at the Hudson Institute at the Center for Global Prosperity. My question is a bit of a nuanced one. So there was a survey done in Russia recently, and a lot of people basically said that they would almost trade up democratic rule for the government taking care of them, essentially, for economic security. And this is 20 years or 25 years after the wall fell. And I'm just questioning how you change sort of the demand of the population, including the youth, to require more from, sort of less from the government and more from the private sector. Because it hasn't happened so much in Russia. I mean, it's happened in other former Soviet states. And so, how do you sort of change that dynamic?
Isabel, do you want to have a go?
Well, look, why has it not happened in Russia? Because Russia has a lot of oil, and they can, like Saudi, pay its people to be on the payroll, on the government payroll. So in a place like Saudi, it will take a very, very long time for that to happen, and it will probably depend on, declining oil production. And, it goes back to your question about why are they importing labor into Saudi? Well, it is partly education, but not solely education. If you look at it, it's also work ethic. I mean, there are companies that there are people with the right educational skills, literacy and numeracy, but not necessarily the accepted soft skills that you actually show up to work on a daily basis, that you work the hours you're supposed to be there. And it's very, very frustrating for employers in those, in particular in the Gulf countries. And they do import labor, but now you're going through a massive policy of nationalization of the labor force in Saudi, in the Emirates. And these are nationalization policies that have been on the books and attempted before, and the private sector has always forced a reversal. But now the government is saying, actually, this is a security risk for us. We have to force Saudiization of our labor force. We have to force Emiratization of our labor force because unemployment is such an urgent issue. So, what is it going to take? It's going to take a number of different drivers. But I also think it does relate to educational reform, starting at an early age, to rethink the notion of citizenship at an early age. What does it mean to be a citizen of a state?
And if I may add, I think from Isabel's discussion, both her main presentation and what she said now, one of the implications is it's normal politics. I mean, like when the state has the resources to be able to buy off the loyalty of the citizens by giving them subsidies, etc., as Russia could or as Saudi Arabia could, they do. But when the state has to have a productive economy to be able to survive as a state, then they do the reforms, as happened in most of Eastern Europe.
And it gets back to this lesson from this book that I edited on crisis being a driver of change, because that was the authoritarian bargain under Suharto, under Sukarno, and then under Suharto for decades in Indonesia. We'll take authoritarianism, but in return we get stability and growth. And when the crisis changes that dynamic, that's what happened in Brazil. That's what happened in Mexico. That's what happened in Indonesia. Even in Poland, you saw solidarity take enormous energy from the population because of economic crisis in the country too. So I think it's a
third
combination.
question from the front row before we move back.
I think just
Go
quickly
ahead.
on the
Sure.
education, I don't want to leave this hanging in there. Yes, it's about education and other factors, but when I talk about reform of education system, I include in that critical thinking, ethics, all of that. So when you talk about civics, when you talk about your role in society, when you talk about reforming education, without that, you're just creating robots they don't need. They need a lot more than that. Productivity in the Gulf countries and most of the Arab world is one of the lowest in the world, 100%. I mean, they say like it's about a crazy number, like a half hour a day productivity. You just go sit down, drink their tea, and leave. So it's really seriously. I know it's funny, but it's that sadly funny. It's education has to change to provide people who can respond to market needs, including everything that Isabel said. That's what's needed from
So
education
basically,
reform.
the takeaway from both your comments is we have to do something about the oil and we have to do something about the tea. Front row. And then I'll come to everybody at the back. So I've noticed everyone.
Bill Tucker, I have a consulting firm. I've done a lot of work in the area. A comment that was made that Libya is taking workers from China instead of Egypt when Egypt has large unemployment. Aren't they doing that because China is requiring that for investment? When they invest in a country, they bring their own workers into the country to do the work, and so the dollar rules as it always does. If you don't have the money, why you don't dictate the terms.
Well, yes. I think it's a combination. It's that it's Chinese projects and investment, as it was Turkish projects and investment with Turkish workers and Chinese workers coming behind it. But, not every country can you get away with that, right? There's also, I think, a demand side for a variety of the reasons we've been talking about that, both from a productivity perspective, a skills perspective, and a work ethic perspective, there was a rationale to import workers. But what I'm saying is looking forward, okay, when you think about that part of the world, Libya is going to do as, Libya's prosperity will be somewhat dependent on the stability and prosperity of its neighbors. And when you live in a really bad neighborhood, it undermines the value of your own home. And I think the Libyans do understand that. And so when you look at this $500 billion that could be spent in Libya in coming years on infrastructure that will be labor intensive, a lot of building of roads and infrastructure, if they're importing labor from China, that's bad for the whole region. So it's just something to think about in a macro sense.
But I think your
actually
point is taken.
But the money is not going to necessarily come from China. I mean, Libya has, $160 billion in sovereign wealth funds. I mean, it's for 5 million people. It's an incredibly wealthy country, and it hasn't even begun to tap its natural resources. So yes, some of the foreign direct investment will come from overseas, but a lot of it will come from its own sovereign wealth.
In the middle here.
Hi, Phil Scotti, Department of State. I've traveled around the world a lot, of course, and one of the things you've touched on in the margins is the question of culture. And this underlies a lot of the challenges that the Middle East faces. Culture is hard to change, takes a long time to do that. Can you address that a little bit? I mean, you touched on it with, tea, but there's a big difference in the culture.
Yeah, this is a recurring question all the time, and the culture that we're talking about is from 1952 till today. The culture in the Arab world is very different before that. And if you take the speed of change today around the world, it's much faster than that. So this is the cultural, social norms that we talk about are very changeable if you change the institutions that write them. So if you focus on the institutions, culture will catch up. I don't see that as a huge impediment in the long term. I see it as a huge impediment right now, but it's changeable. These are new norms, new habits, new things that, civil society was strong before Arab socialism and the Arab military coup d'etats that happened. You had the awqaf that were completely independent from the government. These rulers came and took them. Women's empowerment was much better before than now. Islam was a lot more liberal than it is right now. A lot of things happened in the few decades. If you compare history in the Arab world, these things will change if you change the institutions around them.
And you're right that culture changes slowly, but sometimes when it starts changing, then the change takes effect very quickly. So for example, Malaysia, where Mahathir Mohamad in the 60s wrote the book The Malay Dilemma and said the Malays are sort of, lazy and this and that, and so we don't get to do well, the government has to... And yet, now, all ethnic groups in Malaysia are more or less equally productive. And so that whole sort of, 3 cups of tea during the day rather than doing work, culture has changed.
Absolutely.
And how did that happen? 1960s to now? It's pretty quick. And it has to do with modes of production, it has to do with the economy, it has to do with policy, it has to do with what people are being taught in schools, etc., the values they are being inculcated. Turkey, I don't know. Ottoman Turkey is less than 100 years ago? Ottoman Turkey probably, if you read all the accounts and say all of them are partly at least true of what was the lifestyle, etc., was particularly not very conducive to modern industrialized society. And yet today I think Turkey is pretty modern industrialized society, even when it holds on, or segments of its population hold on to their religious traditions. So I think that these things do affect each other, although culture remains something to think about. Other questions? There were a few hands.
I would just add that when you look at the role of women in societies, in 1945 it was arguably worse to be born a woman in China than in Egypt. Much worse. Much worse. And today the largest number of self-made female billionaires are in China. You went through a cultural revolution that, destroyed culture and at an enormous cost. But cultural change, I think, can happen quite quickly.
It's not something you shrug your shoulders and say that's their culture, can't change.
Yeah.
It can.
But
That's
also,
the whole point.
I think emphasis on trying to change the culture top down are wrong.
Yeah.
I think you should work with the institutions. I keep repeating, change the institutions, culture will come along.
And Abdul Wahab, top down or outside in?
Or outside in is even worse.
That's not easy to change.
So it's not an
either.
effort, you have to change your culture, it's inferior.
Yeah.
That's a wrong approach. But build the institutions, culture will catch up.
There were a couple of hands that went up in there. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mata Ibrahim, former MP from Bahrain. My question is about Saudi Arabia, and to Elizabeth, you said that it is not in the soon future we may see the Saudis are having troubles with the expansion of recurrent budget which goes for salaries. Can you elaborate on this? With the growth of the with the growth of the recurrent budget that goes on salaries, how Saudis can manage with this huge expenditure?
Well, they can manage because the price of oil is consistently over $100 a barrel, and their revenues have gone up commensurate with their spending. But it wasn't so long ago that the price of oil was much lower, and the Saudi state in the early 1990s faced real cash flow problems. I mean, it was on the verge of being not bankrupt, but real financial issues.
Deficit budgets for the first time.
Huge deficit budget. So, we live in an uncertain world. Am I predicting that the price of oil is going to tank again and undo some of these governments? Actually, I don't see the price of oil tanking, but with fracking and the new sources of energy and huge increase in gas production in the United States and new sources of oil coming on in the world, the Saudi break-even point has gone up and up and up. And taking on Egypt as another beneficiary raises its break-even point even higher. And I just don't think it's going to last. The oil is not going to last indefinitely. And the Saudis understand that. And I think that is what's behind Saudiization of the workforce right now, is saying, look, we can't do this and we can't live this model indefinitely. It's why subsidy reform was something very much on the books prior to the Arab revolutions back in 2009, 2010. The Saudis are the largest per capita subsidizers of fuel in the world. And, they are doing enormous investments now in desalinization. It's hugely energy intensive, very, very expensive. But when you look at, with energy so cheap, everybody's air conditioned and driving and, it becomes a very unsustainable way of life. And something's going to give. Is it going to give tomorrow? No. Can they continue to buy stability and buy off unrest for years to come? Yes. How many years? I don't know.
And let's give them a little credit, honestly, about this. You and I know, and by the way, we know each other very well. So, Saudi Arabia today is not threatened by ideology. I don't think there's a chasm in Saudi Arabia from between socialists or communists as it used to in the 60s or even early 70s. There isn't that threat of communism coming from South Yemen. The Saudi Arabian regime doesn't feel threatened ideologically. A little bit in the East Coast through a sectarian issue, but not existentially threatened by it. There was threat from Abdel Nasser's time. There was threat from communism. That has gone. But they actually feel threatened by the youth bulge. You talk to them, you deal with them, they feel threatened by it, and the policies, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, they feel that. And when we go into Saudi Arabia and talk about the need to generate jobs, they're welcoming open arms, come help us, let's do it. But talk about open up some political space, they're not threatened by it. They don't feel people want more political space. So the youth threat to them is real, they know it, they feel it, and they're willing to fix it.
Okay, I'm going to take 3-4 more questions before we break for lunch. So everybody raise your hand so I know who's going to ask the next few questions. Okay, in the middle here, both one after the other.
Good morning. My name is Ricky, and I'm working at the Center for International Private Enterprise with Abdu. My question is actually directed to Isabel.
Of course, because you're not allowed to ask him a question.
Yeah, exactly.
He'll get you for 2 hours later.
Or Mr. Haqqani here. We talked about how education is connected to economic reform. Education reform is economic reform. But we haven't talked about how education happens outside of universities, happens outside of the classroom, how you can learn on the job. And every day I'm reminded of that, working with Abdu. So what role does private sector, businesses, what do they play in, giving youth the opportunity to learn on the job through internships, through mentorship, through apprenticeship, anyship? How do we convince the private sector to give them a chance?
Any ship except the ship of state.
The state ship.
Well, I mean, I think that the private sector has an enormous role to play in this. I think it can't do it on its own. I think you need government and the private sector to work together. You need government to put in place the appropriate curriculum, pedagogy, that by the time kids are 18, 20, entering the workforce, that they have some of the basic skills, and I'm talking about not just basic literacy and numeracy, but critical thinking skills and the ability to work in a somewhat diverse environment, to tolerate some diversity in the workplace, be it men and women working with each other or people from different tribes and different sects and different groups. I mean, maybe we take that for granted, but I'm writing a new book right now about youth education and employment in the Middle East. I've spent many hours and hours interviewing employers, and they are not critical on the literacy and numeracy skills. They say, it's good enough. It's good enough for us to work with. Where they're really critical is in the soft skills, and it's in the inability of their workforce to show up on time and to meet expectations in some very basic ways. And that, I think, is something that does need to be inculcated at an earlier stage. It's also something that private sector can work on and teach. But, even like when you look at Sesame Street in Arabic, I mean, these are things that have, based on polls, we know have had a pretty strong impact on the way that people view the other, their tolerance for diversity, and these are shows that are geared to very young kids. When you look at organizations like Injaz, which is it's junior achievement in the Middle East. I mean, they're working with high school kids, trying to teach a sense of entrepreneurship, of taking risk, of thinking outside the box. When you look at the Education for Employment Foundation, the work that they're doing, they're working with employers and trying to teach these soft skills. So, there are glimmers of hope across the region. And again, I come back to it has to be a combination of government and private sector, and private sector certainly plays a big role in this.
And an entire sort of, attitude towards work. Work, you can take pride in anything you do. There's a tendency, I think, in the Middle Eastern region to actually look down on blue-collar workers, for example, and that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, you won't have that. Probably some people would argue that's happened in this country as well, with every kid wanting to go to college. So all of those things are part of the whole process. Let's have the twin right next to him, and then we can move to other people.
I'll just quickly say, the phenomenon, it is a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
And now you see a larger percentage. I mean, Egypt graduates about a third of its youth from university. The United States graduates about a third of its youth from university. Does that make sense? People are usually surprised when I tell them that statistic. Yeah. We have such a different economy than Egypt does, and yet a third are graduating from university.
Saudi Arabia is probably more.
Yep.
And Saudi Arabia graduates more women than men, and women have better grades than men, yet they're 26% or less of the workforce.
And the unemployment statistics that you were talking about with the higher levels of education, it's in China today. The unemployment is among university graduates.
Yeah.
Right, next. And then we'll have one last question before we break for lunch.
Thanks. My name is Nate Grubman. I work at the Journal of Democracy now. I have a question about these the Saudi plan for these special economic cities. I'm curious, there was this plan, as far as I know, it's still progressing where they're building somewhere between 4 and 6 cities.
No. It's not progressing.
It's not progressing?
No.
So I guess my question is, what was the logic for that, and at what point did the rationale for these cities change, and why did they decide to abandon that plan?
Well, the logic, again, was this very, centralized, top-down decision-making process that said we're going to create 4 to 8 new cities and put them in the desert, and one is going to be based on this and another based on that. I actually last year was at King Abdullah Economic City, which is just north of Jeddah, next to KAUS, King Abdullah University for Science and Technology, and it's pretty much of a ghost town, to be perfectly honest. And that one was built. The others were put on hold. The financial crisis intervened. So, the Saudis have gone through a number of white elephants. If you remember earlier, they were going to be self-sufficient in agriculture and started doing hydroponic farming in the desert. Oh, that one didn't work out so well. So, they have a lot of money, and they tend to throw it at big ideas that take decades and sometimes go off the rails on the way.
Those of us who come from regions that have had elephants know that elephants don't do very well. Real elephants don't do well, whether white or gray. They don't do too well in the desert. So,
can I add just one thing? I know a little bit about these projects. It's the driver for all of this is good, actually, and it's a recognition for the need for jobs. That's what it's the driver for it is good. We had Yamba, if you remember, way before that. Yamba and was the other one Hayel? I forgot the name of the other one. So Hayel and Yamba,
two new cities.
where they were they're supposed to be like a bubble of a place where the laws are different, the regulations are different. You can do things. Saudi society overall, you're not able to do everything you want, but they closed. And KAUS is one of them. Women can drive inside KAUS, but it's to create this bubble and be able to make that a job generation haven in there. If you divide the amount of money spent into it to the job generated, it's over $1 million per job. So the implementation phase, and there are a lot. We can talk forever about this. Part of it is bureaucracy. It takes you go get a job anywhere in UAE. You want to bring your wife and kids. Takes you a week, they're there. In Saudi Arabia, it takes a year and a half. So there are part of it is also buying the land, and then the government has to build the infrastructure. The agreements that happened never came through. Implementation is terrible and just not moving forward. Lots of corruption, but that's also...
Okay, good. So we are moving towards lunch. We have time for one more question, and that question will go to my wife, who's sitting up here in the second row.
Nepotism.
Hey, I have to. It's called survival.
It's called being my own person in my own right.
Of course
Thanks
you are.
for introducing me as your wife. I'm Farnaz Isfahani from the Woodrow Wilson Center, former Member of Parliament from Pakistan. My question is for Elizabeth Coleman. We've talked a lot about the youth bulge here today. I'd like to actually ask you about the gender breakup between men and women. Having lived in the UAE and having observed what has been done there, you see many more young women in government jobs, in small enterprises, etc. And the government's having a very hard time getting the young men to get up, put on their clothes and actually go into any office at all. In a country like Bangladesh, in the export processing zone, the Japanese have all women factories, all Bangladeshi women. So I wanted to ask you, in countries like Egypt, etc., is there any thought to preserving the cultural norms, having sort of all women kind of factories, etc., which foreign entities can deal with, and are women across the board, women in the youth bulge, much more hardworking, and are they a different? Can you break it down for me, please?
Yeah. Well, this is a fascinating topic, and I could go on for hours on this topic, and I won't.
Good.
But just a couple of things. I mean, we've touched upon the fact that now women outnumber men at the higher educational level and outperform men. And it's not a small gap. I mean, in some countries, in Iran, it's 70% of women now, university graduates. Saudi, it's about 65%. And now you're seeing gaps also in certain, what we would think of as more male-dominated profession. In the Middle East today, more than 50% of graduates in life sciences are women. Women in the Middle East, it's the only region in the world where women outperform men on the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math. So, you're seeing something interesting going on here. So you have much of your most valued human capital is female, and yet workforce participation rates of women is still low. It's around 25% across the region, as opposed to more than 50% in Asia, and 60% in industrialized, 60 to 70% in other industrialized countries. So you see very low levels of workforce participation. Now, are women viewed as a source of potential growth and productivity? By some, and certainly not by others. And it's a very, very contentious issue. And so when you say preserving cultural norms, well, whose cultural norms and who's defining those cultural norms? And you've seen battles, battle lines drawn in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya over, what is the culture and how are we going to create a legal system that preserves the culture as we define it in a very conservative religious narrative versus a more modern narrative. And you've seen groups really trying to roll back rights for women in some of these countries, and you've seen other groups say, that's crazy. First of all, it's not consistent with our religious understanding, and economically, it's mad. And so, you're seeing this tension play out. In Egypt, politically, women took a step backwards after the revolution. Now, we've seen another transition in Egypt, and just this week, there are new laws saying, okay, women are going to have a quota politically. 25% of municipal seats are going to be reserved for women. The previous transitional government did not go that route. Women made up less than 2% of the parliament when it was elected. Tunisia, Libya have gone a different route and, really pushed for women's political participation. In Tunisia, it's 25% through a zippered list. Libya, similarly, about 18%. And a recognition that, women are very, very important economically. But this is a much more contentious issue in that part of the world than even in a traditional Muslim country like Bangladesh.
Thank you very much, Abdul Wahab Al-Kepsi and Isabel Coleman. And ladies and gentlemen, we will break for 15 minutes, during which lunch will be served. So it's an easy lunch, sandwiches, just to let you survive until the end of the next panel. And the next panel is on civil society, and we have great speakers for that as well. Sam Tedros, Tamara Witz, and Carl Gershman will be speaking. And oh yes, Ehsan Yilmaz, not to be forgotten, sitting right in front of me. And I was saying, have I counted right? Yes, Ehsan Yilmaz is Tamara Witz, Sam Tedros, and Carl Gershman. And we will have that in 15 minutes from now. So 12 o'clock, try and eat and be back in the room. Thank you all very much.